Picture a fog-laden evening in 14th century Europe, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and burning herbs, the silence broken only by the distant toll of a church bell. Streets that once bustled with life now lie eerily empty, save for the occasional figure shrouded in dark robes, dragging a cart piled high with the dead. This was the world of the medieval plagues, where death was not just a visitor but a permanent shadow, and where fear twisted reality into something far more terrifying. In an age without science to explain the horrors unfolding, people turned to the supernatural, weaving tales of curses, vengeful spirits, and the unquiet dead. What if I told you some plague victims were said to rise from their graves, their hollow eyes still gleaming with the fever that claimed them, or that entire villages whispered of phantom processions marching through the night, carrying the souls of the damned? These weren't just stories, they were the desperate attempts of a shattered world to make sense of the unimaginable. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, leaving behind not just corpses but a legacy of dread and superstition. Doctors in beaked masks filled with herbs believed they could ward off the sickness, while others blamed the alignment of the stars or the wrath of God. But stranger still were the accounts that defied all reason, the ones scribbled in the margins of old manuscripts passed down as warnings. There were rumors of towns where the dying would point to a specific person moments before their last breath, only for that accused individual to perish within days. Some swore they saw spectral figures hovering at the foot of plague beds, their presence a death omen no one could escape, and then there were the graves disturbed as if something had clawed its way out. Today, we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover 15 of the most eerie and unsettling stories from these dark times. From cursed burial grounds to whispered legends of the first vampires, these tales reveal how the line between illness and the supernatural blurred in the minds of those living through the terror. You'll hear of a village that vanished overnight, leaving only a single cryptic note behind, and of a physician who claimed the dead spoke to him in his dreams. This isn't just a recounting of tragedy, it's a journey into the shadows of the human psyche, where fear molded reality into something far stranger than fiction. So light a candle, keep your herbs close, and prepare to step into a world where the dead might not have stayed that way. Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 should have been a city of celebration festivals in the square, merchants hawking their wares, children laughing in the sun. Instead, the air filled with the sound of labored breathing and the slap of bare feet against cobblestones, as hundreds of people danced without rest, without joy, without any music at all. It began with one woman, Frau Trophia, stepping into the street and twitching uncontrollably. Within days, the crowd had swelled to nearly 400, their bodies convulsing in a macabre performance that lasted for weeks. Eyewitnesses wrote of faces twisted in agony, of dancers collapsing from exhaustion, their feet bloody and broken, only to rise and continue as if pulled by invisible strings. Some danced until their hearts gave out, others screamed for help even as their limbs refused to obey. At first, the city's leaders thought the cure was more dancing. They hired musicians and built wooden stages, believing the afflicted needed to dance it out. But the horror only deepened. Doctors whispered of curses, pointing to the strange blackened grain in nearby fields, while priests blamed demonic possession. Modern theories suggest ergot poisoning, a mold on rye that causes hallucinations and muscle spasms, but no one can explain why the mania spread so rapidly, leaping from person to person like a living thing. Some accounts describe bystanders joining the dance against their will, as if seized by an unseen force. Others tell of a spectral piper, his melody heard only by the dying, leading them in their final delirious steps. The most chilling detail, when authorities finally dragged the survivors to a mountaintop shrine, pleading for divine intervention, the dancing stopped as suddenly as it began. Those still alive fell into a sleep so deep many never woke, To this day, no one knows what truly gripped Strasbourg that summer, whether it was poison, madness, or something far older, something that slithered out of the dark and clung to the living like a fever dream. All that remains are the records, yellowed with age, that speak of a city that danced itself to death. Beneath the quiet soil of medieval Poland, something far more sinister than disease waited in the dark. Archaeologists digging through centuries-old burial sites have uncovered graves that tell a chilling story: bodies buried with sickles pressed against their throats, stones wedged between their jaws, even decapitated skulls placed carefully between their knees. These weren't ordinary burials, they were precautions. During the brutal waves of plague that swept through Eastern Europe, entire villages became convinced that some of the dead weren't staying dead. When a family would perish one by one under identical symptoms, or when fresh graves showed signs of disturbance, the terrified living took matters into their own hands. A sickle across the neck ensured that if the corpse tried to rise, it would sever its own head. A stone in the mouth stopped it from chewing through its shroud, or worse, from spreading curses with its final breath. Some were pinned to the earth with iron rods, their hands bound tightly to prevent them from clawing their way back to the surface. But who were these so-called vampires? Modern forensic studies reveal a heartbreaking truth. Many were likely just plague victims, their bodies buried hastily during outbreaks. The ones singled out for these grisly measures often had physical differences: a limp, a hunched back, even something as simple as being left-handed. Others might have been the first to die in a household, making them easy scapegoats for the relentless spread of disease. Fear transformed grief into something monstrous, and the line between mourning and exorcism blurred. The most unsettling finds are the mass graves where multiple vampires were buried together, some with their heads removed and placed at their feet. In one pit near the village of Roch, 17 bodies were found with sickles and stones, all dating to the height of the plague years. Local legends still whisper about the hungry dead who wandered the countryside at night, bringing sickness with them. Folk songs describe pale figures seen near cemeteries, their mouths stained black, not with blood but with the telltale marks of plague. What's haunting isn't just the brutality of these burials, but the raw desperation behind them. These weren't actions of cruelty, they were acts of survival, a last-ditch attempt to protect the living from an invisible enemy no one understood. In a world where death moved faster than reason, the undead became a terrifyingly logical explanation. And perhaps the most chilling question of all: if you'd lived through those times, watching everyone you loved fall to an unstoppable horror, would you have believed it too? High on the windswept moors of Derbyshire, the village of Eyam made a choice that would etch its name into history, not with screams but with silence. When the bubonic plague arrived in 1665, carried in a box of infested cloth from London, the villagers knew what was coming. They could have fled, scattering the sickness across the countryside. Instead, led by their rector William Mompesson, they did the unthinkable. They sealed themselves off from the world. For 14 months, Eyam became a living tomb, its borders marked by eerie, plague stones, boundary markers where outsiders would leave supplies in exchange for coins disinfected with vinegar. The sacrifice was almost incomprehensible. Families watched loved ones wither in isolated cottages, their final goodbyes shouted across fields to avoid infection. One mother buried 6 children in a single month. Another family, the Thorpes, lost 9 members in 8 days. But the most haunting relics aren't just the numbers, it's what lingers. Walk Eyam's lanes today and you'll find cottage door frames still scarred by red crosses, hastily painted by panicked neighbors to mark infected homes. The Riley graves, a cluster of moss-covered stones on the moor, tell a particularly grim tale. Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and all 6 children there within a week, digging the graves herself under the indifferent sky. Yet Eyam's horror birthed something stranger still, a folklore thick with restless spirits. Locals whisper of the Plague Maiden, a spectral figure seen near the boundary stones, her skirts rustling though no wind blows. Some claim she's the ghost of Eyam, a young woman who stood at a distance to meet her lover from a neighboring village until the day she simply stopped appearing. He later learned she died weeks earlier. Others swear they've heard ghostly children's laughter near the old village well, where frantic parents once dropped buckets to retrieve water without touching the contaminated rope. What chills most isn't the death, but the life that persisted amidst it. The villagers held church services in an open field called Cucklet Delph, standing far apart to pray under the open sky. They invented early contactless trade, leaving wool and food at designated spots to barter without touch. Even in despair, they found ways to care, like the farmer who, after losing his wife, tied a loaf of bread to his infected neighbor's doorknob every morning until he too succumbed. Eyam's self-imposed quarantine saved countless lives in surrounding towns, but the price was written in empty hearths and silent looms. When the plague finally burned out, over 260 villagers lay dead, leaving the settlement nearly hollow. Today, the stones remain, so do the stories, and if you stand very still at twilight near the Riley graves, you might just hear the echo of a shovel biting into earth over and over as one woman's grief reshaped the hillside. Amidst the suffocating dread of the Black Death, a peculiar figure began appearing in terrified whispers across Europe, a spectre draped not in the familiar dark robes of plague doctors, but in something far more sinister. Witnesses described a tall, gaunt form with hollowed eyes, its presence marked by the scent of rotting herbs and an unnatural chill in the air. They called it the Angel of Death, and its appearances were said to herald the worst outbreaks. In the Italian city of Florence, chroniclers wrote of a shadowy shape gliding through the streets at dusk, lingering outside homes where, within days, every occupant would perish. In London, a midwife claimed to have seen it leaning over a child's cradle the night before an entire block succumbed to fever. This wasn't the beaked mask plague physician we recognize today. Those iconic figures emerged later during 17th century outbreaks. No, the Angel of Death was something far older, a kind of folkloric premonition woven from desperation. Some accounts describe it carrying a rusted scythe, not to harvest souls but to tap rhythmically on doors, its hollow knocks echoing like a death sentence. Others swore it wore a cloak stitched from burial shrouds, its edges crawling with beetles and flies. What makes these stories especially chilling is their consistency across regions, as if the collective trauma of the plague had conjured the same nightmare independently in 1,000 terrified minds. Modern psychologists might recognize this as a form of mass hallucination, exhausted brains, drowning in grief and fear, projecting their terror onto random shadows. But there's another, eerier possibility. Recent research into ergot poisoning caused by moldy grain suggests some sightings could have been fueled by shared hallucinations. Entire communities eating contaminated bread might have literally seen the same phantom. Then there's the macabre reality of actual plague doctors. Their long, waxed coats and incense-filled masks designed to protect them from miasma would have made them uncanny figures roaming the streets. Could the angel have been a distorted memory of these early medical responders, twisted by grief into something monstrous? The darkest twist lies in the few accounts that defy explanation. A manuscript from Vienna describes an entire convent witnessing the figure standing silently in their courtyard during quarantine until the nuns realized it wasn't outside the gates at all, but inside, moving untouched through their locked chapel. Another from Marseille tells of a beggar who swore the angel whispered names to him, a list that matched the next week's dead exactly. We'll never know how much was superstition, how much was neurological distress from malnourishment and trauma, or whether something else, something we've forgotten how to see, walked those plagued streets. What remains is the unsettling truth that when humanity stares too long into the abyss sometimes stares back wearing a face we never expected. Deep beneath London's modern streets, where the clatter of buses and chatter of crowds now drown out centuries of whispers, there lies a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Charterhouse Square, a quiet green oasis in the heart of the city, hides a secret beneath its manicured lawns, a vast, tangled pit where thousands of plague victims were dumped in panic during the Black Death. But this wasn't just a graveyard. According to centuries of laborers, archaeologists, and even modern construction crews, it's a place where the dead still speak. In the mid-1900s, workers digging a new subway line near the square reported something impossible. As their shovels struck the first crumbling bones, several men swore they heard a chorus of faint, garbled voices rising from the earth. Some dismissed it as wind whistling through tunnels until one laborer, pale and shaking, insisted the voices had whispered numbers to him. Days later, officials confirmed a fresh outbreak of disease just blocks away, the number of cases matching the digits he'd heard precisely. Coincidence, perhaps, but this wasn't the first time. Records from the 1700s describe a bricklayer collapsing in terror after seeing spectral figures hovering over the square, gaunt, skeletal shapes pointing toward the docks. Within weeks, a ship from Marseille brought the plague back to London's waterfront, igniting a new wave of death. Even earlier, in 1625, a gravedigger named Thomas Hayes wrote in his Journal of Dreams where the corpses sat up one by one, reciting dates that later proved to be peaks of recurring outbreaks. The most chilling account comes from 1947, when a night watchman patrolling the square claimed to see the ground breathing, mist rising in rhythmic pulses before forming shapes resembling bodies stacked in a pit. That winter, the city suffered its worst flu epidemic in decades. Skeptics argue these are just urban legends, the products of overactive imaginations steeped in the square's grim history. But the sheer consistency of the reports is unsettling. Nearly every major excavation or disturbance of the site has been followed by some variation of the same story, workers hearing warnings, seeing apparitions, or experiencing vivid nightmares of being dragged underground. Some modern researchers suggest infrasound, low-frequency vibrations from construction, could trigger feelings of dread or visions. Others point to the psychological weight of confronting such concentrated mortality, where the mind might conjure patterns from trauma. Yet one detail defies easy explanation. In 2012, during Crossrail construction, engineers uncovered a mass grave so densely packed that skeletons lay in near-perfect layers, their bones still bearing the telltale dark splotches of bubonic infection. As archaeologists worked, several reported equipment malfunctions, cameras flashing randomly, audio recorders picking up static that resolved when slowed down into fragmented whispers. The most unsettling moment came when a junior researcher, reviewing footage later, noticed something the team had missed: a handprint in the mud beside a child's skeleton, far too fresh to belong to any of the dead or the living. Whether prophecy, hallucination, or something beyond our understanding, the stories of Charterhouse Square force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the face of unimaginable suffering, the line between memory and premonition blurs. The plague pits weren't just dumping grounds, they were time capsules of collective agony, and perhaps in ways we can't yet explain, that agony still echoes. Stand in the square today and you might hear only birdsong, but dig a little deeper and the past might just dig back. The sea has always been a place of superstition, but during the plague years, the waves carried more than just salt and storms, they bore floating coffins. Picture a merchant ship like the St. Roch drifting into Marseille's harbor in 1720, its sails still rigged, its decks eerily silent. When boarding parties climbed aboard, they found every sailor dead, their faces blackened with plague, their hands still clutching rosaries or the rails as if they'd tried to outrun death itself. The ship's log told the grim story, first one feverish sailor, then another, until finally the last surviving crewman scrawled a single sentence before succumbing: "God have mercy on us." Such ghost ships became harbingers of doom, their very presence sending port cities into lockdown. Venice, terrified of these floating plague nests, took drastic measures. Ships suspected of infection were forced to anchor at Poveglia, a small island where crews and passengers would wait sometimes for 40 days, sometimes forever. Poveglia's history reads like a catalogue of horrors. Originally a quarantine station, it became a dumping ground for the sick and dying. Its soil so saturated with bones that modern excavations turn up human remains with every shovel stroke. Locals swear the island is cursed, plagued by more than just disease. Fishermen avoid its shores, claiming to hear screams carrying across the water at night. One legend tells of a 19th century doctor who supposedly experimented on patients in the island's asylum, hurling himself from the bell tower after being driven mad by their phantom whispers. Today, the tower stands in ruins, but visitors still report the faint scent of burning flesh near its base, though no fire burns for miles. The most chilling accounts come from would-be explorers who have tried to spend a night there. Paranormal investigators describe camera batteries draining inexplicably, sudden temperature drops in midsummer, and shadows that move against the wind. One team in 2013 captured audio of a child's voice pleading in medieval Venetian dialect, "Non mi lasciare qui," "Don't leave me here." Historians later confirmed the phrase matched the desperate cries of plague orphans abandoned on the island during outbreaks, yet Poveglia isn't alone. Off the coast of Denmark, the island of Lindholm holds mass graves from a similar quarantine, where 16th century victims were buried face down to stop their souls from escaping. In New York, the abandoned North Brother Island housed the Typhoid Mary Quarantine Hospital, where former patients report seeing spectral nurses still making rounds in rusted medical carts. These islands became microcosms of the era's terror, places where society exiled its nightmares, only to find the nightmares never truly left. What lingers isn't just the tragedy, but the silence. These ships and islands were meant to contain death, yet time and tide have blurred those boundaries. Divers exploring wrecked plague ships describe an unnatural stillness, as if the water itself remembers. And perhaps it does. In 2019, marine archaeologists studying a preserved 17th century quarantine vessel off Croatia found something impossible. The ship's bell, salvaged from the wreck, still tolls when no one touches it, its hollow ring echoing through research labs like a warning from the deep. When the plague arrived in the German city of Trier in 1581, it didn't just bring fever and swollen lymph nodes, it ignited a firestorm of paranoia that would burn through the community like wildfire. As carts piled high with bodies rolled through the streets, desperate citizens searched for someone to blame. Their answer came in the form of an old woman named Dietlind, accused of brewing plague in her cauldron and sprinkling it on doorsteps under cover of darkness. Under torture, she confessed to joining a coven of witches who flew on broomsticks to spread the sickness. By the time the frenzy ended, over 350 people, mostly women, mostly poor, had been executed in Trier alone. This wasn't justice, it was collective hysteria weaponized against the vulnerable. The logic was twisted but horribly consistent. If disease came from unseen miasmas or divine punishment, why couldn't it also come from human malice? Pamphlets circulated across Europe depicting witches poisoning wells or anointing doorknobs with plague ointment made from, according to one lurid confession, the fat of unbaptized babies. In Switzerland, accused witch Anna Gerlde was forced to admit she'd received a pouch of black powder from the devil himself, said to cause boils identical to buboes. Never mind that these confessions were extracted with thumb screws and strappado ropes that dislocated shoulders. The details didn't need to make sense, they just needed to feed the terror. Some of the most chilling records come from the trial of Walpurga Horsemannin in Bavaria, one of the few cases where actual court transcripts survive. Interrogators pressed her to describe how witches allegedly gathered at Sabbaths to plot infection routes, with Satan providing maps of towns marked for destruction. Her broken replies, scribbled by a clerk, reveal how trauma reshaped memory. We were told to touch the lintels of houses, the sickness would follow our fingers like smoke. Modern scholars note the eerie parallel to actual quarantine practices. Washing door frames with vinegar was common plague prevention. Had desperate attempts to stop the disease been reinterpreted as witchcraft? The tragedy deepened as opportunistic accusers exploited the chaos. In Lorraine, a midwife named Claudia was denounced by a rival who coveted her herbal remedies. In Sweden, children coached by panic-stricken parents pointed at beggars, claiming they'd seen them blow plague like dandelion seeds. The worst outbreaks coincided with the worst persecutions, not because witches caused plague, but because plague made people see witches everywhere. Even animals weren't safe. In 17th century Burgundy, townspeople massacred stray cats en masse, convinced they were witches' familiars spreading infection. The bitter irony, those cats might have controlled rat populations carrying actual plague bacteria. What lingers isn't just the brutality, but the speed at which fear erased reason. A single rumor in 1585, Strasbourg claimed witches were stealing communion wafers to consecrate them for curses. Within weeks, 31 women burned at the stake. Their ashes hadn't even cooled when another outbreak struck, proving too late that no amount of bloodshed could halt the plague's march. Perhaps the most haunting relic of this madness sits in a museum in Trier, a rusted witch's collar with spikes facing inward, designed to prevent the wearer from uttering spells during transport to execution. It's a silent testament to the darkest truth of all. When faced with the unimaginable, humanity's first instinct isn't always to heal. Sometimes it's simply to hurt back. In the choking grip of the Black Death, when medicine failed and prayers seemed to fall on deaf ears, people turned to figures who straddled the line between holiness and horror: the plague saints. Take Saint Roch, the patron saint of contagion victims, whose story reads like a medieval thriller. Born to wealth in 14th century France, he gave away his fortune to wander plague-stricken regions, healing the sick with nothing but a touch. Legends claim he himself contracted the disease while nursing strangers, retreating to a forest to die only to be kept alive by a dog that brought him bread each day. When he finally succumbed, towns discovering his body reported miraculous cures among those who touched his relics. Soon, his bones were divided across Europe like sacred lottery tickets, each fragment believed to radiate protective power. Churches boasted of owning his finger, his kneecap, even strands of hair, all displayed in gilded cases while desperate crowds pressed close, hoping for immunity. But not all plague spirituality carried this glimmer of hope. In Spain's Martyrs of Cordoba cult, salvation came through surrender. This fringe group, active during the worst outbreaks, preached that the plague was divine punishment, and the only escape was to embrace death as atonement. Followers willingly infected themselves with pus from buboes, believing martyrdom would spare their souls. Some even staged public penance marches, walking barefoot through infected neighborhoods while flagellating themselves with iron-tipped whips, their blood mingling with the filth of the streets. Contemporary accounts describe them collapsing in euphoric trances, whispering that they saw angels collecting the dead. The cult's most chilling ritual involved the last embrace, where healthy members would lie beside corpses in mass graves, praying until fever claimed them too. The line between devotion and delusion blurred further with Saint Sebastian, often invoked against plague despite his grisly martyrdom, tied to a tree and shot with arrows. Artists depicted him riddled with wounds that eerily resembled buboes, making him a twisted mirror of the suffering he was meant to alleviate. In Venice, during the 1576 outbreak, the Senate ordered a procession carrying his relics through the streets. When cases dropped afterward, credit went to the saint, never mind that the gathering likely spread the disease further. perhaps the most macabre fusion of faith and fear centered around the cadaver synod of Pope Formosus. Though predating the plague era by centuries, his exhumed, rotting corpse became a morbid symbol during outbreaks. Some priests, desperate to shock their flocks into repentance, displayed his mummified remains as a warning. This was a pope, imagine what awaits you. In Milan, a nun claimed to have visions of the dead pontiff walking through plague wards, his skeletal hand gesturing to those who would die within 3 days. What united these saints and cults was their terrifying duality. They offered both comfort and a reflection of the era's darkest fears. To kneel before Saint Roch's relics was to beg for life. To join the martyrs of Cordoba was to court death willingly. In a world where the disease seemed to pick victims at random, these extremes gave people the illusion of control, a way to either cheat fate or meet it head-on. The irony cuts deep. The very rituals meant to end suffering often propagated it, as pilgrims crowded around sacred sites or self-flagellants spread infection with every lash. Yet even today, in churches from Prague to Palermo, you'll find candles burning before plague saints, proof that when faced with the unimaginable, humanity will always grasp for miracles, no matter how strange or sinister their shape. The roads of medieval Europe ran red in more ways than one during the plague years. Among the most disturbing sights were the processions of flagellants, fanatical penitents who believed the Black Death was God's wrath made flesh, and that only through extreme suffering could they turn divine anger away. Clad in coarse hooded robes marked with red crosses, these men and women marched from town to town in disciplined columns, their chants rising above the rhythmic crack of leather whips studded with iron barbs. Each lash tore into their backs, drawing blood that splattered onto the cobblestones like macabre rain. Witnesses described the sound as a butcher's shop at harvest time, the air thick with the metallic tang of open wounds and the keening of onlookers who believed they were witnessing something holy. This wasn't casual self-punishment, it was ritualized theater of pain designed to shock civilizations back into God's grace. The movement began in Germany around 1348, led by shadowy figures claiming visions of the Virgin Mary weeping over a world drowning in sin. Their solution was brutal simplicity: 33.5 days of public flagellation, 1 day for each year of Christ's life, during which followers would beat themselves 3 times daily while reciting psalms. The half-day symbolized humanity's unfinished repentance. Soon, thousands joined, leaving fields and workshops empty as entire villages fell under the spell of their grim charisma. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes straight from nightmares. In Strasbourg, a group of flagellants reportedly dragged a wagon piled with rotting plague corpses behind them, stopping to press their bleeding backs against the bodies as penitential communion. In Milan, one leader, a former cobbler named Albert, convinced his followers that whipping children would guarantee their family's survival. The most extreme factions added grotesque twists. Some sewed live scorpions into their wounds, believing the venom purified the blood. Others rubbed salt and vinegar into their flayed skin to keep the pain awake. What began as grassroots fervor soon spiraled into something darker. The flagellants developed their own hierarchy, complete with initiation rites where new members had to lick the wounds of veterans. They declared all clergy corrupt, burning papal bulls in town squares and performing mock baptisms in blood. By 1349, their sermons had taken an ominous turn. Jews, they claimed, were poisoning wells to spread plague under Satan's orders. The result was a wave of pogroms across the Rhine Valley, where entire Jewish communities were burned alive in their homes. The church, initially tolerant, soon realized this movement threatened its very foundation. When flagellant leaders began absolving sins directly bypassing priests, Pope Clement VI issued a bull condemning them as heretics. Authorities from Basel to Burgundy started hunting them down. Some were hanged with their own whips, others were sealed inside plague houses to die with the infected they'd claimed to heal. By 1350, the movement had been crushed, though sporadic outbreaks flared during later epidemics. Yet their legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern forensic archaeologists have identified mass graves in Thuringia containing skeletons with distinctive parallel cuts on the shoulder blades, the telltale marks of ritual flagellation. Even more haunting are the folk songs still whispered in alpine villages, melodies without words that locals claim were sung to drown out the screams of penitents. Perhaps the most chilling relic sits in a Vienna museum, a preserved whip, its leather darkened with centuries-old blood, still curled as if clutching the hand that swung it. The flagellants represent humanity's darkest response to catastrophe, not just fear, but the conviction that suffering could be currency. In their twisted logic, every drop of blood was a transaction with divinity, every scar a receipt for salvation. Their story forces us to ask, when faced with the abyss, how thin is the line between faith and fanaticism, and how easily can desperation twist devotion into something monstrous. The streets of Hamelin in 1284 were never meant to be silent. This was a town that thrived on the laughter of children, until the day 130 of them vanished without a trace. The legend says a piper clad in multicolored robes led them away as punishment for unpaid debts, his hypnotic melody pulling them into the mountains where the earth swallowed them whole. But peel back the layers of this fairy tale, and you'll find something far darker lurking beneath. Modern historians now believe the Pied Piper story may be a folk memory of the plague's devastation, where the piper wasn't a man at all, but death itself, and the children didn't walk away, they fell to an invisible reaper. Across Europe, similar ghost stories cling to the landscape like shadows at dusk. In the French village of Dijon, locals still speak of the petits marcheurs, small figures seen near the ruins of a medieval orphanage, their forms flickering in and out of sight near the plague pits where scores of children were buried hastily during outbreaks. Witnesses describe hearing disjointed nursery rhymes in voices that sound both young and impossibly ancient. One account from 1892 tells of a farmer who followed the sound of a child crying into a field, only to find the ground beneath his feet suddenly give way, revealing a mass grave packed with tiny skeletons, their bones arranged as if they'd been holding hands. The most chilling accounts come from Eyam, the infamous plague village, where visitors report seeing translucent figures in Elizabethan clothing playing near the Riley graves. These apparitions don't behave like typical ghosts. They don't fade when approached or react to the living. Instead, they repeat the same motions endlessly. A girl in a tattered pinafore drops an invisible bouquet of flowers over and over. Two boys toss a ball that never lands. Psychologists suggest these sightings might be a form of collective trauma imprinted on the land, where grief-stricken parents hallucinated their lost children long after the plague had passed, passing the visions down through generations like an inherited nightmare. But some details defy easy explanation. In the German town of Bamberg, archaeologists excavating a 15th-century cemetery uncovered a row of child-sized graves, each with a small bronze bell tied around the ankle. Local folklore claims these were warding bells, meant to alert the living if the dead tried to rise. Stranger still were the reports from the dig team. Several members swore they heard faint ringing at night, though all the bells had been removed and catalogued by midday. One intern's audio recorder captured the sound of running footsteps and giggling, despite the site being locked and empty. Perhaps the most unsettling theory connects these phantom children to the plague charms found across medieval Europe. Parents would pin handwritten prayers to their children's clothing, begging saints for protection. Some of these notes, preserved in museums, contain eerie postscripts added later. If you find this, know I've gone with the others, or tell mama I tried to stay. Were these the last words of real children or something else? In the Austrian Alps, villagers still avoid certain mountain paths at dusk, claiming to hear the echo of tiny voices singing a plague-era lullaby. Close your eyes, don't look back, the piper comes for those who lack. The song predates the Hamelin legend by centuries, suggesting this fear of vanishing children runs deeper than any single story. What makes these tales so enduring isn't just their horror, but their heartbreaking humanity. In an age where parents often lost multiple children in a single week, the mind would grasp for any explanation, even a magical piper, rather than accept the randomness of pestilence. The ghost stories may be folklore, but the grief that birthed them was as real as the tiny shoes left empty by doorways, as tangible as the toys buried with their owners because no one was left to cherish them. Stand in one of these villages at twilight, and you might not see spectral children, but you'll feel the weight of centuries of love and loss pressing down, whispering that some tragedies are too vast to ever truly fade. Milan in 1630 was a city of locked doors and whispered prayers, a place where the fear of plague ran so deep that even the healthy were treated as ghosts. At the heart of this terror stood the Lazaretto, a sprawling quarantine complex where the sick were hauled to die or worse, to be buried alive by mistake. This wasn't just rumors. Official records from the city's health magistrates confirmed the grim reality. Amid the chaos of mass graves and collapsing order, some victims in the throes of fever-induced comas were pronounced dead prematurely. By the time they woke, it was often too late, trapped beneath layers of soil, their final moments spent clawing at coffins already lowered into pits. The Lazaretto's walls tell stories no historian can fully explain. Workers restoring the site in the 1980s uncovered scratches on the interior, bricks not from tools but from fingernails, concentrated near the old patient cells. Local archivists found a physician's note from 1631 describing cries from beneath the floors, dismissed at the time as hallucinations from infected colleagues. But the most chilling evidence comes from the bones themselves. A 2018 excavation revealed skeletons with fractured finger bones and dirt-packed throats, their limbs twisted into positions suggesting frantic struggle. One young woman's remains were found curled around a wooden cross, her jaw unhinged in what forensic anthropologists believe was a final scream. And then there are the sounds. For centuries, residents near the Lazaretto ruins have reported hearing muffled knocking after midnight, rhythmic and desperate, like fists against old wood. In 1974, a group of university students recording ambient noise for an architecture project captured something impossible. A faint voice whispering in archaic Milanese dialect, "Aiutate me, help me." The audio, later analyzed by linguists, matched regional plague-era speech patterns. Even skeptics can't explain the recurring phenomenon of wet patches appearing on the Lazaretto's remaining walls during droughts, the liquid testing negative for modern contaminants but bearing traces of salt consistent with evaporated tears. The horror didn't end with burial. Milan's desperation birthed a gruesome practice called the safety cordon, guard posts where sentries would shoot anyone trying to flee quarantine. Some victims, delirious with fever, wandered into these zones believing they'd escaped. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves without identification, creating a macabre statistical anomaly, death tolls that never matched missing persons lists. Modern genealogists tracing 16th century families hit dead ends where entire branches vanish from records mid-outbreak, their fates unknown. Perhaps the most heartbreaking relics are the last letters, scribbled notes found sealed in the Lazaretto's walls during renovations. Penned by those who knew they'd been misdiagnosed, these fragile papers beg for anyone, to check their graves. One, written by a silk merchant named Giovanni Battista, reads, "If you find this, tap 3 times on my coffin lid. I will answer if I can." The cruel irony, his burial site was later paved over to build a market square. To this day, vendors there sometimes report feeling phantom vibrations underfoot, as if something beneath the cobblestones still waits to be heard. Ghost stories usually belong to the realm of campfire tales, but Milan's plague horrors force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In times of panic, the line between alive and dead grows terrifyingly thin. The lazaretto stands today as a monument not just to disease, but to humanity's capacity for both fatal errors and enduring remorse. Its whispers aren't just echoes of the past, they're reminders of how easily fear can make monsters of us all. In the panic-stricken streets of plague-ridden Europe, even the most ordinary objects could become vessels of terror. Take the innocent-seeming children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosy, a cheerful tune with lyrics that hide a much darker legacy. Rosy likely refers to the rosy rash of plague victims, while Pocketful of Posies nods to the flowers people carried to mask the stench of decay. Ashes, Ashes echoes the crackling of funeral pyres, and We All Fall Down, a grim acceptance of inevitable death. What began as a coping mechanism singing about horror to make it bearable became a cultural relic, its origins blurred by time but its roots sunk deep in tragedy. But songs weren't the only everyday items twisted by fear. Fabrics, especially imported silks and linens, were accused of holding the plague like cursed talismans. In Venice, health inspectors burned entire shipments of cloth from the East, convinced the vibrant dyes carried disease. One merchant's ledger from 1632 details a shipment of Flemish lace condemned as poisoned by the breath of witches. Its delicate threads burned in the Piazza San Marco while crowds hurled curses. Even more unsettling were the plague blankets, fabrics rumored to spread sickness intentionally. In Marseille, a group of Huguenots was lynched after whispers claimed they'd soaked bedding in infected pus and gifted it to Catholic neighbors. The paranoia seeped into household objects too. Mirrors, believed to trap souls, were covered in black cloth during outbreaks to prevent the dead from watching the living. Cutlery made of pewter was melted down after a German physician claimed the metal drew pestilence like a lodestone. Even money became suspect. Coins were scrubbed with vinegar or dropped into fires to purge them, leaving behind pitted, discolored relics now prized by collectors for their eerie histories. Perhaps the most haunting artifacts are the so-called plague crosses, crude wooden talismans carved by desperate hands. Found tucked into walls or buried under doorsteps across Europe, many bear not religious symbols but frantic scribbles, lists of names, dates of deaths, or sketches of buboes. One discovered in a Parisian attic in 2019 had a single word gouged into its surface: pourquoi, why. The grain of the wood frayed around the letters as if carved by agitated, trembling fingers. What makes these objects so chilling isn't just their macabre origins, but how they reveal a universal human impulse to assign blame to the tangible when faced with the incomprehensible. A child's rhyme, a bolt of fabric, a handful of coins, none could truly carry sickness, yet in the collective psyche they became as dangerous as any corpse. Today, museums display these items behind glass. THEIR Chinese letter neatly catalogued, but handle them even centuries later and you'll notice something peculiar. Curators often wear gloves. Not for preservation, but because old fears die harder than we admit. When the Black Death first slithered through Europe's streets, people didn't just fear the disease, they hunted the hands behind it. In a world where science couldn't yet explain germ theory, the plague demanded a villain, and across the continent, communities found theirs in the most vulnerable. The myth of Jewish well poisoning wasn't just superstition, it was a deadly conspiracy theory with a body count. In Strasbourg alone, over 900 Jews were burned alive in 1349, their ashes dumped into the Rhine as purification. What began as whispers that shadowy figures were tainting water under cover of night exploded into full-scale pogroms, fueled by confessional letters allegedly found on captured conspirators. These documents, later proven forgeries, described meetings with the devil and recipes for plague powder made from desecrated communion wafers. The tragic irony. Jewish communities observing kosher hygiene laws often had lower mortality rates, making their survival seem like proof of guilt to panicked neighbors. But scapegoating wasn't limited to religious minorities. In France, the nobleman Gilles de Rais, already infamous as Bluebeard, faced fresh accusations during the plague years. Once a celebrated war hero, his descent into occult obsession became a cautionary tale. Witnesses claimed they'd seen him conducting midnight rituals in his castle chapel, summoning demons he believed could control the plague's spread. Trial records describe jars of blackened liquid hidden in his cellars, labeled with the names of neighboring villages that later suffered outbreaks. Modern historians suspect these were alchemical experiments gone wrong, perhaps early attempts at distilling mercury or other cures, but to terrified peasants, they were evidence of a noble playing God with pestilence. The darkest twist in these narratives wasn't just the violence they unleashed, but how authorities weaponized them. In Basel, the city council offered bounties for accusations of well poisoning, paying informants with the property of the condemned. A traveling preacher named Konrad Schmid whipped crowds into frenzies with lurid descriptions of plague banquets, where Jews allegedly feasted while Christians starved, never mind that Schmid himself was later caught hoarding grain. Even the medical community wasn't immune. Physician Jacques Dubois wrote a treatise claiming Jewish blood was inhospitable to miasma, suggesting their immunity proved divine punishment for Christian sins. What makes these stories so chilling isn't their medieval strangeness, but their familiarity. The same mechanisms that turned minorities into targets: rumor, fear of the other, the desperate need to impose order on chaos echo through history. In Milan, a leper colony was massacred after someone noticed the plague seemed to spare them. In Spain, Muslim converts to Christianity were accused of brewing plague in sorcerous stills. The common thread, when faced with the unimaginable, humanity's oldest instinct isn't just to find answers, it's to find someone to blame. Perhaps the most haunting artifact of this hysteria sits in a Nuremberg museum, a 14th century well bucket, its wood charred from attempted purification fires. The placard notes it was never used to poison water, only to draw it for a Jewish quarter, later erased from the map. Centuries later, the wood still smells faintly of smoke, a reminder that fear burns hotter than any plague. Some villages didn't just suffer during the plague years, they vanished from the map entirely, erased as completely as if they'd been swallowed by the earth. Take Graben, a once thriving German settlement near Heidelberg. In 1635, it was a bustling community of farmers and craftsmen. By 1636, it was a ghost town, its cottages standing empty, meals rotting on tables, livestock wandering untended. The only clue to its fate was found scrawled on the church door: "Gott hat uns verlassen," God has abandoned us. Modern excavations tell the rest of the story. Bodies crammed into shallow trenches, their limbs tangled together in frantic embraces, some still clutching crucifixes or children's toys. One skeleton, identified as the village blacksmith by his tools, was found kneeling near the well, his hands frozen in prayer around a rusted bucket. These phantom settlements dot Europe's landscape like open wounds. In England's Derbyshire, the hamlet of Eyam's fate is well documented, but lesser known is nearby Middleton Dale, a mining community that simply stopped. Hikers in the 1970s stumbled upon its overgrown ruins, including a tavern where pewter mugs still sat on the bar, layered with centuries of dust. Beneath the floorboards, archaeologists found 17 skeletons curled together in the cellar, their bones bearing the telltale dark stains of septicemic plague. The chilling detail: several showed signs of having been alive when the building was deliberately set ablaze. Charred timbers suggest someone tried to contain the outbreak by sealing the sick inside. The most unsettling discoveries come from the remote alpine village of Obersaxon in Switzerland. When a landslide in 1982 exposed part of its forgotten churchyard, workers uncovered a mass grave arranged in a bizarre pattern, bodies radiating outward like spokes on a wheel, their heads pointing toward the center. At the hub lay the skeleton of a woman in a nun's habit, her hands clutching a wooden box containing 6 shriveled rats. Carbon dating confirmed the scene coincided with the plague's arrival in 1487. Local folklore speaks of a pestmutter, a holy woman who supposedly lured diseased spirits into animal vessels before sacrificing herself to save others. Whether truth or legend, the unearthed remains suggest some final, desperate ritual froze in time. Modern ghost hunters flock to these abandoned sites, drawn by accounts of unexplained phenomena. In Graben, visitors report hearing phantom church bells at dusk, though no steeple remains. Thermal cameras at Middleton Dale have captured cold spots precisely where the cellar skeletons were found. But the most compelling evidence comes from audio recordings. Electronic voice phenomena picked up in these ruins often contain snippets of medieval German or Latin, usually just single words: Feuer, fire, Hilf mir, help me, or simply Warum. Why? Skeptics blame wind through ruins or pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns in randomness. Yet the consistency is unsettling. The same phrases recur across unrelated sites, as if the land itself remembers the terror. Perhaps the most poignant relics aren't the bones or buildings, but the everyday objects frozen in catastrophe. A child's doll carved from ash wood, half-finished on a workbench in Graben. A cookpot in Obersaxon still holding the petrified remains of what might have been a last, uneaten meal. These weren't just plague deaths, they were sudden erasures of entire worlds where the rhythm of daily life stopped mid-breath. Walking these overgrown lanes today, you're not just stepping over graves, you're treading on the silence left behind when laughter, arguments, lullabies, and gossip were snuffed out in a matter of weeks. The earth here doesn't just hold bones, it cradles the weight of stories cut abruptly short, waiting centuries for someone to listen. Even as plague carts rumbled through the streets and mass graves yawned open, a different kind of contagion spread whispers of prophecy. The most infamous seer, Michel de Nostradame, better known as Nostradamus, began his rise during the worst outbreaks. His cryptic quatrains passed hand to trembling hand like forbidden currency. What few realize is that his early fame came not from predicting royal deaths or wars, but from a supposed vision about the plague's end. In 1546, he reportedly told a mob in Aix-en-Provence that the sickness would vanish when the river runs silver with fish bones. The next week, a bizarre algal bloom turned the local waters metallic gray, coinciding with a sudden drop in cases. Whether luck or manipulation, the event cemented his reputation as a prophet of pestilence. His later writings became riddles wrapped in terror, verses about the black rain and crimson tongues licking at the stars, interpreted by panicked crowds as coded plague omens. But Nostradamus was far from alone. In Strasbourg, a beggar named Matthias claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a plague ward, handing him a scroll listing dates when entire cities would perish. His predictions were so precise down to the hour of certain death spikes that authorities branded him a witch and burned him at the stake, only for his prophecies to keep unfolding. Meanwhile, Italian mystic Sister Benedetta carved feverish warnings into her convent's walls, insisting angels had shown her a future where the living envied the dead. Her most chilling engraving, a date 1630, and the phrase, "The breath of Rome will stop." That year, Rome's plague deaths peaked so dramatically that gravediggers worked by torchlight through the night. Yet amid the despair, counter-legends bloomed like flowers through cracked pavement. In London's East End, where entire families succumbed in days, a story spread of a spectral nurse, a woman in tattered robes who appeared at 6 moments before recovery, wiping brows with ghostly hands. Survivors swore her touch left a scent of lavender and iron, a combination folklorists now recognize as traditional plague medicine ingredients. Over in Flanders, peasants told of the Grey Monk, a hooded figure who paced the outskirts of infected villages, ringing a bell that somehow silenced death rattles. These weren't just comfort tales, they were psychological lifelines, ways to imagine mercy in a merciless time. The most striking contrast came in 1710 Marseille during the city's last great outbreak. As Nostradamus-style doom peddlers preached about the final plague, an opposing legend emerged, the so-called Angel of Mons. Witnesses described a radiant figure floating above the city's plague walls, scattering what looked like rose petals that dissolved before touching the ground. Days later, the outbreak abruptly waned. Historians debate whether it was mass hysteria or an early instance of placebo effect, but the stories had tangible power. Marseille's recovery was swifter and more orderly than other cities, with fewer panicked suicides or riots. What makes these prophecies and apparitions so fascinating isn't their accuracy, but their duality. For every Nostradamus stoking terror, there was a grey monk offering solace. Both reveal the same truth. When faced with the unimaginable, humanity will conjure explanations, whether dreadful or divine, to fill the void where understanding should be. The prophecies that endured weren't the ones predicting doom, but those allowing room for hope. Perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still whisper about angels while forgetting the doomsayers, because even in history's darkest corners, light leaves the deeper imprint. From ghost ships to cursed burial grounds, each of these 15 stories carries echoes of the same primal human fears: the terror of the unknown, the desperate search for meaning in suffering, and the fragile line between superstition and survival. Whether it was the phantom children of Hamelin or the self-flagellants tearing their own flesh to appease an angry god, our ancestors faced the unimaginable by weaving narratives that made chaos feel controllable, if only for a moment. Their solutions seem bizarre to modern eyes: sickles across corpses' throats, villagers barricading themselves into open graves. But strip away the medieval trappings, and you'll find something achingly familiar: the universal human need to assign blame, seek patterns, and carve hope from despair. Resilience took many forms. Some, like Eyam's villagers, chose self-sacrifice, wrapping their compassion in quarantine. Others, like Milan's doomed lazaretto patients, scratched prayers into walls with broken fingernails. What unites these stories isn't just the horror, but the raw ingenuity of those who refuse to surrender to despair, whether through science, faith, or folklore. Even the darkest tales, the witch trials, the scapegoating, the whispers of vampiric plagues, reveal a terrible truth: fear can make monsters of the kindest souls when survival hangs in the balance. So as we turn away from these haunted centuries, one question lingers: are these eerie legends really so different from our own modern myths? When faced with pandemics, natural disasters, or existential threats, don't we still spin narratives to tame the chaos? The specifics change. No one today blames dancing manias on cursed grain, but the impulse remains. Perhaps these stories endure not because they're strange, but because they're mirrors. They force us to ask, how would we have acted in their place? And what tales will future generations tell about the shadows we've conjured to explain our own collective nightmares? Before you go, we'd love to hear your local legends. Every town has its ghost stories. Does yours whisper of plague pits, weeping saints, or doors still marked with fading red crosses? Share them below, and let's keep these memories alive. After all, history isn't just written in ink and parchment. Sometimes it's etched in bone, buried in song, or carried on the breath of those who refuse to let the past stay silent.